Hello and welcome to the Many Savage Worlds podcast, a podcast dedicated to setting and world creation for the Savage Worlds RPG system. We're going to be talking about creating a sci-fi setting this week. I'm joined by Nathan. If you watch the show, you've seen him before. He's here again with us. And of course, I'm Dan Cook. Before we get started, I'd just like to say you can follow us on Facebook and G+ at the Many Savage Worlds podcast. You can see the show or listen to it on iTunes and YouTube. You can email us at the Many Savage Worlds podcast at gmail.com. And if you like the show, if you want to support us further, you can find us on Patreon, all with the same name, the Many Savage Worlds podcast. All this information will be in the description below the video if you want to check it out. We appreciate that. We're happy to hear from you. So like I said, this week we're going to be doing sci-fi. We're going to be talking about creating a sci-fi setting. We spoke a little bit before the show amongst ourselves, but not as much as we usually do. So this is going to be a little bit more freeform than usual. But I think we were all really excited to be doing sci-fi. And I think we feel a little more comfortable with it than some of the other settings we may have talked about in the past. So I'm just going to turn it over to Nathan and say, Nathan, what... Well, I posted up. I don't know if you saw it. I posted up on the Facebook page for us. What makes a good sci-fi setting? And I wanted to know what you thought. And we got one reply, and I'm going to read off what the person said. I had my own thoughts, but I wanted to say to you, what do you think makes a really good sci-fi? What's essential that sort of cannot be overlooked when talking about good sci-fi?
Okay, yeah, that's a big one. So for me, I tend to like the larger-than-life science fiction, space opera, that sort of thing. That's more in my wheelhouse. For me, the big thing with science fiction, the only stipulation I really have, though, ultimately, is it's speculative. And I think that's huge, particularly in science fiction, is... hey, if we had this technology, what could we do with it? Heck, even Jurassic Park is considered science fiction. I mean, that theory has been debunked, I believe, but the idea of extracting DNA and recreating dinosaurs that's still science fiction. It's mostly action adventure, but it still has that element to it. And to me, that's really all you need is that speculative element. And then of course you have varied opinions. There are people that I don't think they know the subgenre, but there's quite a few people I've met that are like, no, it's not science fiction if this isn't rooted in direct, deep science, and it has to be this really could happen. And that's fine, but that's hard sci-fi as a subcategory. Whereas me, I'm all about Flash Gordon. And that sort of stuff, which is considered science fiction, sure. Some might say science fantasy. Personally, I put Star Wars in the sci-fi category, space opera sort of thing. That kind of stuff. So for me, really, it's just, is it speculative or not?
All right, yeah, I think that's really great. You hit on some of the things that I definitely wanted to make sure that we discussed. Hard versus soft sci-fi. What that means. I think a lot of the listeners are probably going to be familiar with that. It's like a pretty common phrase thrown around. It's not really a mystery to most people, especially when you talk about setting creation. That's kind of like the first thing you have to tackle. But I like some of the stuff you were saying, how deeply rooted in science it really is. And so me personally, I'm more of a fan of the soft sci-fi.
Right, same.
Because I'm not a scientist. I can't really wrap my head around a lot of the things, and I'd love to, and some of the stuff I can make sense of, sure. And I know a little bit about space travel. I mean, I watch TV and read books occasionally, and but I don't want to be doing so much homework in order to write a good setting that my players are going to say, well, that's not how this works. That's not how fuel burns in outer space. And what about the temperatures? And I don't know about those things. So if you go soft, it leaves you a lot more room to be creative and be playful with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that's great. So I just pulled up the comment, and I'm going to read off. We got a response on the Facebook page from Tim. I'm going to assume it's Smith. It's a Y in the last name, but we'll say Tim Smith. He says, I think one of the best things to have is a real variety of planets. I love a good, quick world generator. And so I hadn't really thought about that. But so if you're going to write your own setting, I think that's crucial. Campaign, not a one-shot. If you're going to have a one-shot, you create the world and you know where they're going, obviously.
Right.
But, I mean, you do some writing. So, a world generator could be invaluable to somebody who wants to run a campaign. It's super simple, too. I mean, a lot of people, you see them do the random tables for Savage Worlds with decks of cards to keep that sort of flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Super easy. You could even do. There is a world generator, isn't there? Sci-Fi Companion.
I believe so. Yeah.
I think I have it.
But yeah, I love the Sci-Fi Companion, but I've never used the generator. I don't think.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna pull up because I have a folder with all my PDFs, and I'm pretty sure I have it, but I can't remember if it's that or the Supers Companion.
Yeah, there definitely was one because the last Parsec setting that went with it had an adventure generator and said, "Hey, use the world generator in the companion." That's right.
Yeah. And if I recall correctly, you roll. I think you roll, but it's a series of different charts. So it's like, what is the gravity like? What is the flora and fauna like? The temperatures, and you just roll out all these dice and you add them all together to create this planet. Really cool. It could leave some room for some weird stuff to come up. But yeah, I mean, if you have the the Sci-Fi Companion, you could use that to create your world generator. If you don't, you could create your own, definitely. And I think it's a really good idea to have for a campaign.
There's a lot of online generators too that like you can just, it's a one-stop shop, click and go. I would recommend some, but I can't think of the name of the ones I've used previously off the top of my head for gaming purposes. But yeah, definitely, world generator is really important, and I think it's really important when you're doing explorative science fiction. Because Terminator could be considered science fiction, but you're not going to be exploring other worlds. But if you're doing something like Star Trek or something else in that vein, absolutely, like 100%. And actually, a good generator I would recommend. There's a free version of a OSR game called Stars Without Number, and you can totally use all of the generators in there for Savage Worlds, no problem. I believe it's free or pay what you want for the basic version. Fantastic material. So
I've heard a lot about that. I haven't checked it out.
There's outlets.
Yeah. And I was actually going to say that don't be afraid to use somebody else's, a different system. If they have a good generator for, like he said, Stars Without Numbers, or, the D20 put out a sci-fi game.
Right.
If you have these, use them to your advantage. Everything that make a GM's job easier it's a good thing. So that's something we didn't really talk about. We didn't talk about, like, what would we like for sci-fi. So I think that we kind of like that big space travel. We kind of made the comparison between Star Trek. Star Wars is in the similar vein, but Star Wars was a lot more like politically driven and not as much about exploration. But I think we like the idea of this like very big, endless amount of planets, exploring, visiting new places. That was sort of the feel that we were leaning towards, which is why I thought to mention the planet generator and another thing that I really liked, and it kind of falls into the same vein, is races. So alien races are huge in like big planet sci-fi. I like the idea of, instead of a GM sitting down and saying, okay, here's 5, here's 10, here's 15. I took time to make 50 races. Allow your players to make whatever race they want. Proofread it, double check it, make sure that it fits what you're going for. Lay some limitations down if you want. If you're going to be on a spaceship, don't let them be an aquatic being that has to be in water. Sure, they could live in a fish tank on the planet, on the ship, but it's not going to be much fun when you land. Or don't let them be like a sentient toaster. Or do.
Right. If you're going for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, then sure.
Sure. And I like quirky. Don't get me wrong. I really take a comedic approach to a lot of my, maybe not a lot, but at least half the time. I really like that really fun, lighthearted.
Yeah.
I think it speaks really well to Savage Worlds as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, use the custom race rules. Allow the players to make whatever race they want, more or less. You set the limit. I mean, as anybody who's familiar with the custom race rules knows, it's at a +2, which balances out the human. You can adjust that. You can say, okay, it's a +4.
Right.
You could also say no humans. You could say the human race. Again, you have to work on some backstory yourself. You have to figure out what happened, why they're there. But are there still humans? I mean, in Star Trek, the planet Earth is still there, and they're just up there exploring among all these other things. But is Earth gone, or is it so far removed through history that whatever the lore happens to be, have it reflected in your races?
Something I. Oh, sorry.
No, go right ahead. That was about it.
I was just gonna say something I've done previously. When I was playtesting for a systemless setting I did called Astonishing Worlds, which is very 1960s Star Trek. One of the things that I did for that was I had a race called Near Humans, which are just like, okay, this guy's got a forehead ridge, or this guy's skin is blue, but he's basically human. One of the things that I said was, okay, guys, just you get +2 to build the race, but that's it. Like, typically with Savage Worlds, it has to balance at +2. Like, you could have 6 points in total and then take 4 points of negatives. But I said, no, you get 2 points. As you would as a human, you get 2 points for the edge. You get 2 points. No balancing, just the two. And the reason I did that was because they were near humans. They're very close to human. And so I wanted to keep that like, yeah, you're a little different, but not majorly. And that worked really well, actually. The players didn't seem to mind the restriction. So,
yeah, that's a really interesting approach. And actually, I think Bobby mentioned something like that because he was part of our pre-show discussion, even though he wasn't able to make it tonight. Excuse me. He had said the same thing, that balance it at the +2, but then limit how much for the negative. So, like, yeah, your total has to be +2 when you're all done, but you're only allowed to incur a -2 to counterbalance, or whatever the case may be. But I think what you said is really. When you think about humans, I mean, a lot of the edges are not the same as the racial modifiers, but really the racial modifiers are just edges.
right.
So all you're doing is taking an edge on top of a human template and then calling your human something different.
Right. Yeah. It's all about the trappings.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to take a little less homework, you could do something like that. And I think if you're going to exclude humans, it's good to have something like that where they are the generic race. To parallel a very popular Pinnacle product is 50 Fathoms has that. Oh God, I can't remember the name now. They have that one race that they're humans, pretty much. They're like the humans of the setting world.
Yeah, and it's been a long time since I've read it.
Me too, and I'm drawing a complete blank. And I'd open it up, but I wouldn't get there fast enough without derailing the conversation. So I'm not going to. But anybody who's a fan of 50 Fathoms knows what I'm talking about. They have a race that it shadows humans perfectly, and they have racial modifiers, but they're like very basic, and they look like humans, they act like humans, and I think their only real catch that I recall is that their first and last names all began with the same consonant sound.
Yeah,
that was the quirk, is that they. To do something like that, you can get rid of humans and still have humans if your players want to play generic characters, because somebody's going to want it. You're going to have some uncreative character who can't relate to an alien race and wants to be the human because for some reason they think humans are better. You got to let them. It's part of being a GM.
Well, I think too, sometimes it's just that relatable factor. Like, players just want, they want the fantasy of exploring new worlds and doing those things, but sometimes it's nice to still feel like yourself a little bit. I get that.
It's true, and like new players, it's a lot easier to role play.
Yeah.
If it's something that you can feel like connected to, which I totally get that. I still, as a player, can find really unrelatable characters that kind of stump me. Mm-hmm. So, all right, so that covers races. Planets, like actual physical setting is going to be kind of jumping around a lot. Obviously, if you're doing like a big, expansive universe setting. Lots of different planets. Every planet of the week, pretty much.
Gosh, yeah.
One thing that comes to mind for me is, and we've discussed it in the other shows because it was relevant, and I don't know how it fits into sci-fi. So I'll put it out there to see what you think, is magic. Because magic is just used to replace technology, more or less.
Right. Right. So, like, the default answer always, I feel like, with Savage sci-fi stuff is like, oh, just arcane background psionics, right? Like, oh,
Sure.
they're psychic. That covers your magic. If you're doing something like Firefly, they are River in this situation. You probably have to limit the power list if you wanted to mimic River pretty closely, but yeah, that's that kind of thing. I can honestly, once again, I mean, we've said this before, weird science fits almost everything. I think it could explain some things. Heck, like if you're doing something like Doctor Who, his sonic screwdriver is like all of his devices, so it's just all of his weird science things. So yeah, I mean, I could see either of those. Magic, sure. I think you're getting into the realm of science fantasy when you do that. Although that is a fine line because the Force is basically magic.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, so I agree. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, and I don't think anything of what you're saying is wrong. And I think a lot of it is reflected through pop culture, like you said. You gave some really great examples to help support it, because I think it helps people to understand when you can put it in context that they're familiar with. Yeah, psionics has a place. I may limit it to races, like certain races are able to possess psionics.
right.
Weird science. Weird science is the one I kind of take a slight issue with, but only because I've always felt like weird science should be the thing to replace the place science hasn't gotten to yet. Like in
Yeah, I
Deadlands,
understand.
like weird science is like it's science but of the future. But in sci-fi, you have to decide how far science has gone before you can decide like how far weird science can go past it.
That's fair.
But it does. But then you get into things like it's tough because there's things that weird science can do that like would you just make them regular devices? Would there be invisibility shields? Would you be able to activate some device you have that turns you invisible? Or would that still be magic? Well, I guess it would still be magic. That's how it's covered in the rules. But would you, so you have to decide how you want to handle that. And obviously things like blast and stuff, you could just trap those as weapons, and you'd have an infinite amount of different types of grenades and
Yeah.
flamethrowers and plasma launchers and different things of that nature. But not to say it doesn't have a place. It just depends on personal style.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah,
But another thing I thought about with the magic is, what if you included magic for just certain races? Allow it as like the racial modifier. Like if you want to use it, and again, a lot of it depends on the lore. But certain races would have certain access to magic.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd have to decide sort of how to allow it. Like, okay, I'm gonna play. It's an alien race, of course, but there's tied to like almost like elementalists, to go back on kind of fantasy thing. I want them to have like blast and burst of like whatever lightning. Just because if you want to have an offensive magic, some of the other magic would be a lot easier to explain. You could allow it, and you could say, yeah, sure, and it's tied to their racial ability. They, collect electricity like out of the air, and it's just something to do with like some extra organ they have, and they're able to do that. So you could trap it as like a racial thing, and I think that could be fun. It would have to be predefined, and I think a lot of the stuff I speculate on like this, it's better for strong role players that aren't going to min-max and aren't going to try to take advantage of a system being put in front of them. I consider myself a fair role player. I guess I wouldn't say strong. I like to think that I am, but realistically, probably not. But character concept-wise, I think I commit pretty fully. I recently just started a game, playing in one, and I'm really excited. And my original character concept was going to be really fun, and then I realized that he was not good at anything. Like,
right.
A complete detriment to the team. And I was like, but it's going to be so much fun to play. And I did end up changing it because I didn't want to be a drain on the rest of everyone else playing.
Right.
It's important to have people, though, that are willing to commit to these things and not say, well, I have an arcane background. I'm going to take all the magic spells. You can't stop me. It's, I did it. Or if your players do that, just put your foot down as a GM and just tell them, no, that's not the way this works.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Savage World core book is really a toolkit in a lot of respects, and so as long as everyone's on the same page. Well, and something I was going to say, kind of going back to your idea of the psionics or something in that vein being specific to a race, you could always say to the players, if you're doing, hey, you have so many points to build a race, you can say you can take that edge with those points. After that, you can't take that edge. Like, that's how you can get that edge, is with your racial points.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. I think it should be limited to character creation if you're going to use that approach.
Right.
It should not be able. Yeah, no, you can't buy it through in advance. I wouldn't allow that.
Well, I'm saying, like, and this is technical, but I would say, like, even, because you can get edges through taking hindrances. I'm saying they specifically have to spend their racial points to get it. It's a part of their race.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if you're going to do it that way with races like that, which is cool, because I feel like, well, Trek, for example, they have some psychic kind of races here and there every once in a while. They're either like really over the top powerful, or they like kind of have some abilities. There's a character in Voyager, Kess, I believe, who had some psionic abilities, and it was like inherent to her race, and that's how they do it in there. Is all racially inherent. So yeah, like I could totally see that. That makes perfect sense to me. And it kind of adds to the mysticism of it, which is nice.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really great point. That's a really great idea. A good way to handle it. Because if it's tied to race, it should be mechanically tied to race. I mean, there's some accountability to be had. So Magic's pretty easy, depending on how you want to go about it. But there's some ideas to get you going. Let's see. Setting, races, Magic. We spoke a little bit, and this is one of those things that's going to be really hard to do, and it's going to depend, and you'd probably change it in the middle of the game. But let's talk about spaceships and space travel. As much as I really don't want to, because it's opening up a can of worms on itself. But I mean, a lot of the time when you're talking about space travel, it's going to be for plot. We're flying here to there. This part breaks down, and now we have to go get it. We crash land, and now our ship is broken, and we need to find the part. These are great plot devices. Good way to keep the story moving. If your group hits a down period and they don't want to go put themselves in danger, you can force them, because something can go horribly, horribly wrong.
Right.
And that's really nice to be able to do to them. But what about when your ship wants to have a shootout or a chase? Realistically, ships are going to have weapon systems, with the exception of some. I mean, it's going to be very similar to like modern aircrafts or sea vessels. Sure, cruise ships don't have weapon systems, but there's a plethora of military ships. And if you look back, even like pirates, every ship had a weapon system because they were at risk of being attacked. So if space pirating becomes a thing, you're going to see a lot more ships armoring up and arming themselves more heavily in order to combat this. So, I mean, we know the chase rules, and I know they're highly debated. And black's right around the corner, so we'll see what happens. But they might not get any better. So, I mean, do we run chases the way they're written? I mean, you could do a dramatic. There's lots of dramatic tasks, social conflict. They all work essentially the same way with a different name on them, though.
More or less, yeah.
You could run a chase. There's nothing wrong with them. I know people don't like them that much, but they're okay, and they accomplish, narrated a little bit, and you have an okay chase.
Yeah, I've noticed, like, it seems like a lot of people who were, like, around with the previous edition of Savage Worlds kind of had some issue with the newer rules. I came in with this edition, so it hasn't bothered me. Like, Savage Worlds in and of itself is sometimes, like, really theater of the mind, and then sometimes it's really tactical. And so I think that's just one of its theater of the mind moments, is the chase scenes. For me, something that I would probably do personally is, like, you mentioned dramatic task. I would, especially if I'm running something like Trek. And the reason for that is if you watch those fight scenes, it's almost the entire time you're looking at the deck of the ship. Um, and if they lose, they're dead. Like it's that big. And of course, that's always the case with combat, right? But the difference here is like, with a ship combat, oh, we could crash land or something like that. But in Star Trek, in those kind of shows, it's very much like, hey, this is all just going to explode. Like when we beat the enemy, it's just gone. And so that would qualify as a dramatic task for sure. You could have your captain barking orders with a persuasion roll or spirit roll, kind of leading the charge, and everyone doing their support rolls. I could see something like that personally. But in all fairness, when in doubt, dramatic task for me, honestly, like that's just kind of how I GM. If I'm not sure, I'm just like, oh, this will work, and everyone knows it. But yeah, that's what I would do in the core. I mean, the Sci-Fi companion suggests chases. They have a lot of stats for that. But dramatic task, you don't need to do combat at all. You just make your rolls do your thing. So that's what I would do personally to avoid having to have all the spaceship gear.
Yeah. So I have the Sci-Fi companion I looked, and I do have. That's why I knew about the world generator. I've read it a few times, but I'm not super familiar with it yet. Just because I don't use a lot of the extra, because I GM my homebrew games a lot like how I talk about on the show.
Right.
Where I just think about it and I say what makes sense and what's going to work and what's going to create the least amount of headaches for everyone involved. And if you get a new player, I don't want them to be confused about like where all these extra rules are coming from. With that said, the only thing I would be worried about with dramatic task is how lethal they can be. I mean, with an entire crew, you have a lot of assist rolls, and the captain should probably be qualified at what they're doing. You imagine whoever takes the captain position. Right. So you shouldn't worry as much.
Yeah.
But I do always get scared with dramatic tasks because my home group that I play with regularly always fails. I don't know how, but they just can never. I can't ever put them in a life or death dramatic task because they are not going to make it. They're so bad at them.
Right.
But
if you're running a lighter game, you can always say, okay, you get to the escape pods, but your ship is gone.
That's true.
There's or you're captured. They want your ship to sell for parts, so they capture you. I mean, there's ways around it, but yeah, I do get what you're saying. It's
you could avoid the total destruction route and do right. They board you and sort of like I'm not as much of a Star Trek fan as you are, admittedly, but Star Wars, you see that they just sort of just scoop up the ship right inside. The Empire just engulfs it, and now you're stuck inside. So yeah, I mean, I think space travel, space combat, chases, getaways, it all kind of has to be handled through plot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when it comes to Savage Worlds, that's the only real way to handle vehicle stuff, unless you really want to get yourself bogged down with some craziness. If you want to run a chase, try it. See if you like it. Oh, excuse me. Dramatic task is always good. And we started talking about it. You kind of touched down on it. And we had spoken pre-show. Crew positions.
Right.
I kind of like the idea. I made the suggestion. Every person should have a crew position. So are you familiar? Well, again, we talked about 50 Fathoms, and you said you did some reading on it. And I've never read it, but I've heard some stuff about Pirates of the Spanish Main, which is the other big pirate setting, which is a little more like historically based, if I'm correct about that. I think I am.
Yeah, it's actually based on a miniatures game by WizKids back in the day.
Oh, nice.
I used to play it actually when I was
cool.
a youngin'. Yeah, but yeah, it is. That game was historically ish accurate. They started adding ghost ships and stuff, but yeah.
So I know that at least in Pirates of the Spanish Main, and I believe 50 Fathoms follows the same suit. All your PCs take on roles throughout the ship, but they don't fill all the roles because a full-fledged pirate ship would have 20 to plus crewmen. So you take on important roles. Somebody might be the quartermaster, Somebody might be, well, speaking about pirate ships, but let's go back to spaceships because that's really what we're here to talk about. You might have somebody who is the like communications officer. You might have somebody who you're going to probably want an engineer. Again, if you don't fill the positions, they can be taken over by NPCs because you have to fill them all because that's just part of like running a full-fledged ship. You could have somebody who wants to take the captain's position. Right. Then you start to get into like rank and structure, and I think it's better to have a level playing field. Everyone is sort of like a second tier, like everyone's a lieutenant. So you'd have like, first mate, communications officer, a gunner, or like some sort of combat specialist. An engineer. You could have a doctor who would be pretty high ranked throughout a ship. Of course, it would still be like research positions. Because when you talk about exploring, well, I guess it depends on the nature of exploring. And we'll get into that next. I think the nature of like what our game more specifically would be about. Because we've been kind of talking in very broad strokes so far about like a sci-fi world hopping game as a whole. You're right. But we'll talk a little bit specifically about like what we were envisioning. But I think if each person takes a crew position, that way dramatic tasks, if you have a combat or a chase, whatever the case may be, you could have everyone make these supporting roles because everyone's going to be working together, sort of like that Star Trek thing. You see the bridge, and this person's doing that and this person's doing that, but they're all working towards a common goal. And then you could just roll I guess the actual roll wouldn't be, it would be more like mass combat, where you're rolling a dice. And then everyone's making supporting rolls, but nobody's really rolling their actual, like the main dice roll isn't one person making the roll, if that makes any sense. There's some options. This is something you could do with it. You could have like a ship stat, or the captain would have stats if you wanted to fall back on like an NPC captain. What skill you choose to use. I haven't given it much thought. But it was something that it kind of crossed my mind in passing, and I thought it would be really cool to have all the PCs take up positions throughout the crew, and that way everyone sort of has a place there.
Yeah, I ran a game. It was a homebrew space opera using the Sci-Fi companion. We did. We had a captain. Our player was the captain, and I had been hesitant. You get the story, and they just tell you what to do. That's ridiculous. But I wasn't worried about her because she's very considerate. So, that wasn't a problem. But you're right. Like in most cases, I could definitely see that. And the downside to an NPC captain, I think, would be that I think a lot of players might feel railroaded if you're not careful with that. If you make it a captain that's like supposed to be close friends with his superior, not superior, but his, the closer officers to his rank, which would be the players. In that case, you could always just have him say like, "What do you think?" or like, "I defer to your judgment." Have those moments, and then there you go. It's not as railroady that way.
Yeah, and you do run the risk of like the first mate. And so you say like, no captain, but then somebody's gonna take the first mate position because that's like a lower level officer. And you run the risk of them becoming essentially the de facto captain.
Yeah.
You also you also have the option of, this is kind of my go-to, is like run it as like a council. These people are all on equal grounds that all have to make joint decisions. And I mean, I've found that my groups, most people I've played with, they're not looking for a fight. I mean, I listen to some like actual plays from time to time, and like I hear like some role players, and like they love that they arguing, and like, nope, we're not doing that. My character would never do that, and like sticking to their guns. But most of the time in your group, somebody's gonna suggest something, and unless it's terrible, your group's gonna go with it. They're just most people don't want to put up the fight, and it's like, well, here's my idea. It's the first one I came up with, and everyone's like, yeah, all right, cool, let's just go for it. Or a few people will throw out ideas, and everybody will kind of latch onto one. You don't have a lot of like inter-party arguing, or I don't. I can't speak for everyone, I suppose.
Yeah, I've also heard of cases where like someone in the group, if it's a regular group, this one guy or one girl, she she tends to be the leader of the group, and so they just like we're like, oh, why don't you just play the captain then? Like, you usually kind of end up leading stuff anyway. But yeah, like I actually really like what you're saying, and especially with what we were going off of pre-show, we kind of talked about maybe for the setting doing like a trade council sort of thing with a trade organization as opposed to like a military group or something like that. So they might explore if they have to drop something off to a planet they've never been to or whatever. But I think that would work really well for a council sort of thing. Because sci-fi. There's like a trade council is pretty common. So
yeah, definitely. And so the first thing I thought of when you said like trade ship, it was we could be the Planet Express. But I thought about that as, I mean, obviously it's not the greatest example of like sci-fi, but it's a really great soft sci-fi. I mean, they go to different planets and there's aliens and like it's really over the top and there's crazy adventures. And for anyone who's didn't catch the reference, Planet Express is the ship from Futurama.
Right.
But you think about that, even the captain on that show, she doesn't have more authority than anybody else. I mean, technically she's in charge, but like not really, because it's a group of ragtag miscreants that don't follow orders mostly. But you sort of mimic that same play style where it's like, yeah, she's the captain, but like she doesn't have final call. And like, sure, there's somebody back home who owns this particular ship and is getting the contracts and sends you out there, but now the crew's out there by themselves, and it's
right.
You do something like that. But yeah, so we talked about like a trade ship, and I think that's a really great idea because it avoids the military thing, which is kind of refreshing, especially on our like setting series so far. We've been like leaning heavily. I mean, it's good to have an organization. It makes the setting easier to get into, but it'll get us away from the government, which would be nice, independent. You're not always obligated to do the right thing. It's kind of cool. And like you said, it allows even if you're making deliveries, you may not have been to every planet you've ever gonna get sent to, and if you do sort of this like endless amount of planets like beyond measure, you're destined to find something new around every turn. So I really like the idea of like the trade company. A lot of different things you could do with that. You could do like independent, where it's like, UPS versus FedEx and like struggling to get ahead. They could be like fully licensed through like trade commissions. Sort of a lot of different options to go. I had, just to throw it out there, because it's funny that this all kind of came up without me ever mentioning a previous thing I did. It was going to be for a one-shot I was going to run. So I wrote some lore for it, but it was a sci-fi setting, and it was it's kind of on the same vein of what we're talking about. And there was two factions that were like controlling, because I really like the idea of like, there being like opposed factions to create that conflict instantly without having to really build it.
Yeah.
There was like sort of the central government that controlled everything, but then there was this radical faction that had broken off, and they were called the Free Trade Federation. And what they were trying to do was just like, get away from like the taxes and the bureaucracy, and they operated amongst themselves. But so you would find some planets that supported one faction, then other planets supported the other faction, and so you could do something like that, where like, it's sort of this like network of free traders that you end up in the wrong planet, and like you're not exactly welcome, and they don't support the free trade, and they're it's very capitalistically driven. Government helps build the conflict, gives you some places to go with it. Again, lore, there's a lot you can do with lore. It can be tough. It can take a little more homework than especially with sci-fi. It's huge, and there's so many options to go from. That's kind of one of the things we talked about. Like, this was going to be a hard setting to pin
Yes.
down because
Yeah.
there's just so many directions you can go in. But let's try to get some get it locked in a little bit, I guess. So trade ship, that's where we put the PCs. So like looking at it from like a very like micro aspect, like the PCs are on a ship, they work for a trade, either a trade company or some sort of trading network. And somebody froze. I don't know if it was me or not. I guess we'll find out. They work for a trade business. They're getting contracts, going out to these planets, doing different things. You can tie in a whole bunch of plot loops into something like that. But do we include a main antagonist? Now, I think that Nathan has frozen on me. So I am just going to roll with it for right now, unfortunately. You could do something like what I was just talking about with like the one-shot setting I had been working on previously, where sure, you're a free operating tradesperson, but then there's this centralized government that has gone out and colonized all these planets, and they're looking to collect their taxes. Or you have the option of other traders, sort of like the Teamster Wars, independent companies versus Teamsters. Way back in the I guess we'll go back to the 20s. But it's important to have conflict. Whatever route you decide to go with a setting like this, you need to have something to create the conflict, because you don't want your players to just be wandering aimlessly, planet to planet. They land, they get off the ship, they walk around and go, oh yeah, no, there's some animals. Oh, let's kill the animals, and all right, we'll go make our delivery, and then we're gonna get back on our ship and fly home and make lots of money and do it all again over and over again. So put in something that is going to be there to create story for them. I said something about it earlier. You could include space pirates. If space pirating has become an issue, and people out there trying to steal cargo, because maybe all of the trade ships have to have a certain emblem on them. Maybe they have to be labeled in a certain way because of regulations. And they all either carry a recognizable serial number, or maybe these space pirates have access to databases where they're, tracking down these ships through whatever means necessary and creating all these problems. Sorry about that, guys. Those are some options for some lore. Again, lore is tricky. It leaves you a lot of options and a lot of places to go with it. So one last thing I wanted to talk about, and unfortunately I'm here by myself now. Nathan had some internet problems. He just sent me a message outside the chat channel. Hopefully he's working to get back on, but I don't know if he'll make it, guys, so it might just be me for the remainder. Another thing I want to discuss is gear. Sci-fi gear can be tricky. People are going to say, I want blaster guns and plasma rifles and this and that. And what I would recommend to any GM out there is look at your gear list in core, look at the consistency between the damage, the ranges, the clip capacity, and carry that over. Call it a laser. It should be 12, 24, 48 range. It should do 2d6 or 2d6 plus 1 damage, even if it's a laser weapon. It does. Hey, Nathan, welcome back.
Hey, sorry about that.
No worries. So I kept going without you only because I'm really not into editing, and I really didn't want to have to go back and crop anything out. So I talked a little bit about the lore. It wasn't anything great, but I just said, here's some options. You could do space pirates. You could do enterprise, evil government entity that is like taxing the traders and causing conflict. I pretty much just said to include something that creates conflict to help the story moving.
Right.
And lore's tricky, and good luck. I can't tell someone how to write lore. I wish I could, because then I'd be publishing books and not doing this podcast. Or maybe both. But the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I just started on it, was gear.
Right.
So for the hope not to backpedal too much, but sci-fi gear is really tricky. I was just talking about weapons, and what I was saying is retrap what's in the book. So I believe where I left off was people are going to say they want laser pistols, but it's a regular pistol. Copy over the range, copy over the damage, increase the clip capacity if you want. If you want to feel more futuristic and more advanced, well, yeah, sure, maybe it doesn't have a 12-round capacity, maybe it's 50. But then don't track ammo. You're only going to create headaches for yourself. It should be, it has this plasma pack that recharges automatically. And it never runs out unless you go full auto or I don't know. There's a couple ways you could handle it. I would probably stick with a standard ammo style, clip, and I might increase capacity a little bit, but not so much to make myself lose my mind. 20 rounds. Stick with 12 rounds. I mean, it doesn't really matter. If people want other crazy things, I mean, it depends on your sci-fi setting. If you're going soft sci-fi, you're probably gonna have some crazy gadgets and. But we're probably not going to do laser swords. It's not really the setting we were talking about here. But if you want to, it's tough. If you want to do it like Star Wars, you really can't. I mean, we don't have any instant kill weapons, and if you want to do that, you're going to create a lot of headaches when your players sneak attack somebody and just stab every person they meet with a lightsaber, because this isn't a movie, and your PCs are going to be D-bags from time to time. But if you want, melee weapons, you can include them, retrap them, and give them the same stats. It's just make sure you retrap it, and just don't tell your players, "Hey guys, that's the Desert Eagle, but we're calling it the laser pistol." Because they're gonna get all upset about it. Just tell them, write it do a little Google Doc, make up a gear list, copy it out of the book, and just change the names really quick and share it to your group, and they're gonna be so blown away at all the work you did to make this really sweet custom gear list for them. Yeah. They're going to love it.
I was running something straight out of core before, and they were like, well, what about weapons? And I'm not a huge fan of the lasers that are in the core, so I actually did tell them, but what I said was, I just said, any of the modern gear, we'll retrap it. Whatever you want to do, we'll just retrap it. And then, hey, what about a shotgun? How can I have a shotgun? That's cool. Sure, we'll figure something out. We made it work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, scatter laser, whatever you want to call it, but it's
right, yeah. So I think instead of a traditional flamethrower, we did some kind of energy cone, sort of ray beam, coming out. But it worked really well. So I mean, in Savage Worlds is really geared for that anyway. I've seen complaints about the gear list before that everything is too similar. But I mean, the reason for that is because, trappings, man. I mean, what it's all about. So.
Yeah, I'm sure if the guys who wrote Core, Shane Hensley, if he had his way, he would have pistol, rifle, shotgun, machine gun, and that would be it. And he wouldn't have 12 pistols listed. He did that for the readers. He did that for the players. Because if you offer your players one pistol, they're going to get all kinds of upset.
Yeah.
But you don't need them. And I mentioned it to the other host. I don't think I mentioned it on Eric's, but I have an old role-playing book, and it is the Call of Cthulhu D20 edition. That's a little embarrassing to admit, but it's not bad. It's pretty bad. The gear section, though, they have the first page of the gear section has a list, and it's pistol, rifle, shotgun, with a damage stat next to it. And that's it. They don't list specifics. And then you go into the gear section further, and it breaks down all the pistols. And there's, 20 to choose from. But they're all almost identical. And they do have variants, kind of like with Core and Savage Worlds. Yeah, sure, you get the +1. You get bigger clip size. They weigh less if you're tracking weight, which nobody does. There are things that make them all slightly different. And you could even go as far to say this one comes with a, laser sight, or this one comes with a scope, so that changes the ranges. And you can do it, but you don't have to. But yeah, I think the only reason that we see so many variants with the weapons and people say, oh, they're all too similar, that's because Shane Hensley wanted to make one pistol, but he knew the readers weren't going to like it. Because with a generic setting, you really just need pistol, and here's the average damage of a pistol, and here's some variant rules in case you need them. That's all we wrote.
Possible, yeah.
That's just my opinion on it, and I could be wrong, and but that's kind of how I see it. Is like, they're all the same for a reason because they're all pistols. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah. Well, and in those, I think Savage Worlds is it's pretty cinematic, and I mean, when you're watching a movie, we don't really in most movies, we don't stop to figure out what kind of pistol's what for what reason and how that will benefit someone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I not at all. Really interesting. I'll go for it. Like, the detail or whatever you want to do. It's your game, right? But at least from where I'm standing, if I'm understanding correctly from where you're standing, it really is just easier. Yeah, just grab a few guns that you think will work. Say, hey, this is a laser rifle. This is what you got. Yeah, I don't see why not.
Yeah, absolutely. As for the other gear, the mundane gear is probably going to be pretty much the same. Sure, your flashlights might be chem lights now. I'm not big on gear anyways, I'll be honest with you. When I run games, I don't make my players pick, they don't spend the $500 usually because I don't want them to buy a bunch of rope and burlap sacks and, I bought, 3 flashlights and this much, food and well, guys, it's a modern setting. You guys have apartments. You don't need to buy food.
Right.
It's assumed you have food in your fridge. So I'm kind of laid back about that stuff anyways. It's just not really my style. I make them buy weapons, and if they want a vehicle, I'll make them buy a vehicle. But even then, sometimes I'm like, should you have to buy a vehicle? Like, if you're playing in a modern setting, most people own a car, or at least something.
Right.
It could be a crappy used car, but in real life, they don't cost that much. I mean, they cost more than $500, but
yeah.
Well, it's a tough one. Gear can be tricky, but
yeah. Well, you can always say too, kind of in the same vein, if you have this trade organization, you can say, well, of course they're going to supply your food for you while you're on the ship. They're going to supply those basic things for you, so you don't have to worry about those things. But yeah, I would say the big thing too is weapons and armor are usually the things I make people buy.
Yeah, I definitely would not require basic living provisions in a setting where you work for a corporation or a small business. They are gonna, if they're sending a ship out across the galaxy, they're gonna provide food, water, basic things, and I also would probably hand wave salary because sure, you have a job and you're making money. That's tricky because players are going to want to buy stuff, but what are they going to buy? All the game time is going to be on a ship. Sure, they could buy a house. I want to beef up my retirement fund and buy that new fancy space car. Well, hand wave it. Yeah, sure. You guys have been working for a couple months and you got your salary and okay, you bought a house, but we're never going to go visit it because our adventures take place on a spaceship. So I would probably hand wave salary. It's gonna come up. People are like, well, I have a job. Shouldn't I get paid? Yeah, you did. You sent it all to your wife. She spent it all while you were working.
Yeah, there you go.
So yeah, I mean that covers gear. Obviously, you're not gonna make them buy a spaceship. That's gonna be provided. It's part of the plot. If the ship's destroyed, tie it in with the plot. I'm just gonna keep saying it's all plot. Even in a campaign, I rely really heavily on plot to drive everything forward. I don't think there's any reason not to. That's Savage Worlds is, well, like you said, it's so cinematic that you never watch a movie and they total the car, and then even if they show a cutscene where they're at a dealership buying a new car, he doesn't you never see him check his bank account first.
Right.
It just happens. They just go get the new car. They go buy the gun. They go. Oh man, we need 10 tuxedos for this bank heist, and they just go buy 10 tuxedos. 10 tuxedos is really expensive, guys.
Right.
but it's plot appropriate. So I think that I mean, that's the basis of like that'll get you through some sci-fi, right? I mean, hand wave everything, throw some lasers and aliens in there so it seems science-y, and
Yeah.
just tell your players to just roll with it. I mean,
Right? Why not?
right? You know, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of like content light, but at the same time, like it doesn't really have to be more than that. I think that's really the biggest thing to remember is like Savage Worlds is really good at doing so many things, depending on how you describe it. Make it feel sciencey, and it'll be sciencey. Use lots of big words, even if you don't know what they mean.
Right.
Make sure you check the flux capacitor.
Yeah, exactly. Technobabble, man. Yeah.
It works.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you were thinking about before we wrap it up? We're just about 9 o'clock now, so I guess we're at a pretty good stopping point. And I've kind of I'm gonna double back to the chat real quick and see if I missed anything from our pre-show.
The only thing I would add, going off of plot there, and I think this is something I don't think we covered this in ships, is I know some people like to have faster than light engine rules, like we need to navigate to get to here or whatnot. For me, that's always speed of plot. The ships go as fast as the speed of plot. I never mess with the downtime in between. It's just not. I just don't think it's worth it. That's just something that I thought of when we were talking about plot, and that's something worth noting too with ships. Is at least for me, unless you're doing a really hard, gritty sci-fi, which we're talking soft sci-fi. Why bother? Just hey, you're at the planet now. Only pause long enough to get up and get a new soda or whatever. Go back to what you're doing. But
yeah, so you know what? You actually hit on something I meant to bring up. Travel in sci-fi is important. People are going to care about it, how they get where they're going. Excuse me. Is everything in the universe, and this is something you have to decide as a GM, but it's something to keep in mind. Is everything mapped out in the universe, or are there uncharted areas? Can they plug it into a GPS and like wormhole wherever they're going, or can they not? And like you said, use the plot, but you want to be consistent with it for your players' sake. So I think it's the last parsec, right? That like part of like the main thing in that is that like they go out and like set up these beacons all around the universe, and like those are used as like a way for the ships to travel from point to point. And if there's no beacon set up, you can't travel there. So there's like uncharted areas, or they might be like tasked with like going out and like fixing one of these things because it allows like more convenient space travel. I believe that's part. I'm not super familiar with it, but if I recall correctly, that's from the last parsec. Sure, most of the universe is charted, and like you use like GPS, and I guess it wouldn't really be satellites because satellites are everywhere. But these beacons, and you can hone in on them, and then boom, fast and light travel, get where you're going, no problem. Or you have like the old like just like slogging through the galaxy. I mean, sure, you're hauling because you're in a spaceship, but like you're really doing the travel the old-fashioned way. Which can be fun. You can do some interludes and random encounter type stuff. And as a trade organization, random encounters could become the backbone of like what happens, because like maybe you're traveling to a very common planet with a great commerce setup, and like when you get there, there's not going to be any problems because you're bringing a shipment of radioactive material from a mine to the biggest metropolis in the universe. So like there's not going to be an adventure when you get there. You're just going to drop it off, but on the way, because you're not able to travel faster than light and you're literally just chugging on through the stars, somebody gets wind of you and catches up to you, or you break down, or whatever the case may be. But then again, if you want everything to just happen like boom, fast travel in a video game, pause, go to the map, click on your location, and click OK, and you're there. That could work too. That's a good comparison. I don't want to discourage that. You can totally do that. You just have to make sure you know what's going to happen to keep the game fresh and interesting. But But those are probably the only two like realistic options for space travel, like plot wise, not like mechanic wise.
Yeah, I mean, you could have a mechanic if you wanted. I just,
Oh yeah,
especially with soft sci-fi, I just didn't see the point. Yeah.
right. Yeah, I wouldn't exactly. It's a lot of flavor more than anything else. So I'm just looking through our pre-show, and it doesn't look like I missed out on anything.
No, I think we hit the high notes there.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. So I guess that just about does it for
Yep.
today. I'll probably think of something the minute we sign off. I usually do, but that's okay. I'll put it in the show notes or post it all over the Facebook page. Hope everyone reads it. Well, with that being said, thank you for joining us for our sci-fi setting. This is episode 3. Join us in 2 weeks for episode 3.5. It'll be the second half. We'll be doing a live, well, not live, but an actual play. In 1 hour. If you're familiar with the show, you've seen them before or heard them before. They're a little frantic, but they're fun. And it spotlights a little bit of like the flavor of it, and we talk about some mechanical stuff from the game. It's a good time. Again, stop by, check us out, review us, drop us a comment, email us, let us know what you think. If there's anything about the show you love, didn't love, let us know. We're happy to hear it. I'm always looking for feedback from the listeners. I try to be really active in responding to everybody. Thank you, Nathan, for being here tonight with me. Check out Nathan, Tricky Troll Games. I don't think I plugged you last time. We were doing the actual play, and they get really frantic. So support the hosts, the guys who come on and help make the show possible with me. Nathan has a publishing company, Tricky Troll Games. Great settings. I couldn't even name them all if I wanted to. Super cheap. Yeah, they're really inexpensive, small settings, so it doesn't take a lot to digest them, and they have a lot of potential. They're really great. With that being said, though, again, thank you for being here, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks.